History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom.
Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of Fannie Lou's Classroom. We're grateful that you join us on today and you're taking your lunch hour perhaps to get a different kind of food on today, one that can certainly nourish your mind and your spirits for the work that we have left to do as we seek to continue to create communities of opportunities where we have access to life-giving, life-sustaining resources. And I'm excited about our conversation today, but before we jump into that, I always have to shout out my team. We first want to give a shout out to Brooke, who handles all of our audio-visual needs for the podcast. And then we want to thank Cheryl and Shanika for the ways they always make sure we're prepped and ready to go, making sure our guests are in the house or online in a good, timely fashion. So we thank them for all of their hard work. So before we jump into the classroom today, we obviously want to take a moment. This is April 4th, and of course, April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. life, ministry, and mission was cut short by an assassin's bullet. And so we just take a moment to just remember him and really to be grateful and thankful. If we really go back and read his speeches, if we really go back and listen to his preaching and his speaking, we will learn more about the man that we don't hear during the holiday weekend when we're celebrating. It's more that king who really did call out the evil powers and the powers that be that really supported and with white savagery really undergirds many of our social structures and institutions. He was nothing short of calling that out and challenging us. And in fact, in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, the last chapter where he talks about the world house, that this nation needs to undergo a revolution of values if we are to make it and survive this world house, or we will all be decimated. And we look at the world around us today, his words ring true now more than ever. And a big part of also King's work that I would say was really where he was headed before his life was cut short was this notion around economic justice. This thing about civil rights is what we really needed to be about in this economic exploitation that takes place in many ways, many of it structural. And so we just thank and honor him in this moment for all that he has meant to us and continue to mean to us. Like most prophets, their words never die, right? Like most revolutionaries, you can kill the revolutionary, but you cannot kill the revolution. So his spirit still lives on today. And I think we'll hear some of that embodied in our amazing guest that we have with us today as we have a conversation around economic justice and what are some of the things we can think about in light of the legacy of King. How might we consider really, engaging in movements that really are not against, but what should we be for to create a more just and equitable society as relates to economics. And so I'm going to introduce our guest on today. I think you're going to, he's talented and gifted in many ways. So I think this conversation is going to be more lively than I had anticipated. People till you read their bios, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, we can take this a few ways. And especially I'll say this in light of what we're dealing with many of our HBCUs, where we know they have always historically been underfunded, and money not allocated as it should have been. And now they've been held to certain standards when they had to do like you do in your own household. When you only have so much money, you do what you can to make the budget stretch, right? You do what you can to make sure that school continues to thrive and the children get what they need. And so I think it's going to be even a good conversation to kind of merge that into this as we talk about institutions and structures as a way of engaging in economic justice. So let me introduce our guest on today. He is the Reverend Dr. Lester McCorn. He is a visionary leader, activist, scholar, author, and administrator. He's the 13th president of Clinton College, a private, historically black college founded in 1894 by the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Newly branded as a beacon for leaders, the new Clinton has experienced dramatic growth in student enrollment and has implemented new programs focused on student success, including new Academic Success Center. Under his leadership, Clinton College has received major grants, including a $3.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to address health disparities, and $500,000 distant learning grant for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and a $200,000 grant from the National Science Foundation, and a $400,000 grant from the Savannah River Nuclear Solutions. The college is currently executing a transformative $25 million campus building program beginning in the spring of 2022. Dr. McCorn is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and a former pastor of churches in Baltimore, Atlanta, Chicago, Boston, and New Haven, Connecticut. He is the author of Standing on Holy Ground, an Africentric ministry approach to prophetic community engagement. A community leader, he is the chair of the board for Habitat Humanity of York County and board member of the Urban League of Central Carolina's Rock Hill Economic Development Corporation and Arts Center at Fountain Park. President McCorn is an alumnus of Morehouse College, Yale Divinity School, and Chicago Theological Seminary. He holds a Doctorate of Ministry degree from United Theological Seminary, where he was a Gardner C. Taylor Fellow in Social Justice and Prophetic Leadership, and an adjunct professor, doctoral mentor. He is currently a candidate for a Doctor of Philosophy in Ethical and Creative Leadership with a specialization in the Martin Luther King Jr. Studies and Social Change, and a certificate in educational leadership at Union Institute and University of Cincinnati, Ohio. President McCorn is part of the 2019 cohort of the Harvard University Seminar for New Presidents. Wow. And I'm going to go ahead and say he is also a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And I'm going to say this because I mess with him all the time when he posted, when I watched the movie. If you ever watched the movie School Days, when you see the Alpha stepping in there, I think you are on the left-hand side with the glasses right in the back.
You got it.
So if you want to see him in his prime, you can catch him on School Days in that episode. So welcome, Dr. McCorn, to Fannie Lou's Classroom. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you, Reverend Danielle. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we're super excited about that. Come on in, Shanika. You don't have to tip. Come on in. They know you're here. So I guess, it's so many things we could talk about. And I think I want to move to the college toward the end of the conversation, but I really want to talk about, because we had Lakeitha Anderson and Reverend Dr. Delman Coates on maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he was talking about the Freedom Plan, right? Also this economic plan for America. So I really want to now talk to you about, because we also have your article that you wrote, MLK's Forgotten Call for Economic Justice. MLK's, yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm sure you're familiar with that. So we have that in front of us. And I'm looking dead at it, right? I'm looking at Martin Luther King Jr., March 14, 1966. But I think it's so important, right, to dig into that part of Dr. King that we don't talk about often. And you have experience in, as we not call it economic development, but community development. Because I also want to talk to us about the difference between the two and why we. So let's just kind of jump off there, right? As we talk about economic justice, a form of that is development in communities, right? So talk to us a little bit about, first, what's the difference between community development and economic development, and why it's important for us to know the two, so that as we engage in our respective communities and city council as well as county persons, we're clear about that.
Yeah. So I guess one distinction might be the difference between structural and systemic, even though they're both very interrelated. Structural community development is structural. It's looking at housing development. It looks at businesses and enterprises that are physically located in communities and people having access to the resources that are there. Economic development is much more systemic. It looks at, it's kind of like the old adage, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Economic development should lead towards lifelong sustainability. And it's about sustainable growth and development for a community. So it's not just having a family dollar in a community. It's about real economic development that fulfills or gives people a fulfilled life. It's
Mm-hmm.
addressing a food desert, right? It's about healthy food. It's about businesses that are owned by people where money circulates, recirculates in a community. So a community becomes, really strong and fulsome in every way. And I think although community development is important, we need better housing, we need nicer buildings, we need better homes. What we really need is economic strength. And so I think we have to have both. That's
Mm-hmm.
that's what I've sought to do, in my ministry and now in the college. We've become an anchor in Rock Hill for economic development. In fact, there's actually a whole South Side development plan that's called the Clinton Connection Action Plan, because someone finally
Mm.
realized that one of the greatest assets we had in Rock Hill was this HBCU that had been there since
Ah.
1894, that had over a $10
Mm.
million economic impact, even though it was a small, relatively small HBCU. And that our growth would obviously fuel and propel the growth of that side of town and ultimately the city of Rock Hill.
So yeah, so because of course now I'm getting ready to go off with another set of questions that I didn't have, and this just happens, right? So because I think
Mm,
you're saying something very important, right? You're in Rock Hill and you're talking about the ways in which this anchor institution,
yeah.
right, serves as an economic engine, and then how do you build out from that to include the larger community? So can you tell us a little bit? So what should we look for what would you say to people in communities, small, medium, or large? What has been your pathway that you're taking? Because I wasn't a math student, but I'm just looking at the quick math of all the grants you received. So,
Yeah.
you have a few $1 million, right, that you have been
Right.
entrusted with, that's going to have not just an impact on your institution, but the community writ large, right, as being that anchor institution. So talk to us about how we need to think about strengthening our institutions and how we do that in ways where we have the community in mind.
Yeah, good. So, probably about 25 years ago, I was introduced to the concept of asset based community development,
Uh-huh.
which was developed at Northwestern University. A couple of guys wrote a great book and they really were looking at what communities were doing already related to community development. And as you know, one of the pitfalls of our communities is that we have a deficit model. We look at all the things we don't have.
Right.
And the truth is, we have much more than we realize. And the only way the powers that be even begin to entertain the conversation is when you talk about it in dollars and cents. Now, we know that our value is much more than capital, but there is a part of the conversation that gains people's attention when you talk about economic impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have been late to the game in our ability to talk about what our real impact is, what it has been historically, what it is right now, and what it could be given the right investments, right?
Yes.
I happen to be a product, as many of our people are, of the horrible travesties of redlining. I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, from the projects. Before it was the projects, it was a vibrant Black community. It was kind of integrated, but most Black folks found the Laurel Clayton neighborhood as their home. So it was a cultural center, it was an economic hub, and families for generations grew up there. And then, of course, model cities happened in the 60s and
Mm-hmm.
70s, and urban renewal, which we knew as Negro removal.
Removal, right.
And so my family was displaced. So my mother and her 5 siblings and my grandmother all had to move. And for a while, with the promise that they have first dibs on coming back to the projects. And
Mm-hmm.
sure enough, we did. My grandmother moved first back into the projects. Then my mother and I and my sister moved into the projects. But as you can imagine, the community was never the same,
Yeah.
right? So that is the tale of any American city that was impacted by model cities and then, of course, redlining. All that to say that our communities have been systemically segregated in ways that it has been very difficult to recover. And we have to have a strategy to address the systemic disinvestment and disenfranchisement that has occasioned our communities. And HBCUs, most of them sit in the middle of these historic communities. And when you travel around, I mean, I used to think about this when I was in Atlanta. I was like, we had this little oasis in the Atlanta University Center with Morehouse and Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown and ITC, Morehouse School of Medicine. But if you walked a few blocks away from the community, you saw all this blight, and you saw dilapidated housing, you saw the Family Dollars, you saw the KFCs, you couldn't find any fresh food for, a couple of miles. And if you go to, name any city that's got an HBCU, you see the same. I'm in Memphis right now. I made it a point to go visit Lemoyne College.
Yes. Yes.
I had to see it. I've only been to Memphis one other time. That was 20 years ago. So HBCUs really were not on my consciousness. But now every city that has an HBCU, if I'm in that town, I'm going by that campus. And so sure enough, I saw it. I mean, all of this blight surrounding this oasis in Memphis. And I'm thinking, man, if the city really wanted to address economic development for people of color, this would be the place to do it. I mean, you could just you use the campus if you use the concentric circle model, the campus is at the center, and then you just begin to develop, housing and businesses and programs and educational programs so that a community has an opportunity to be viable and strong. And so I think, and I'm incorporating the model at Clinton. I'm not the first to do it. I think others have done it, but I think we're on to something where the federal government and people who have resources are beginning to understand the power that HBCUs have to transform communities.
Yes, and I thank you for bringing even at Lemoyne, and I don't know if you notice, and I'm terrible with directions, but if you come down the street, you have several churches, because that area, as you know, used to be a thriving Black community, right? In fact, down the street from Lemoyne on the corner, you have what used to be People's Grocery Store.
Yes, I saw the marker.
Yes, who, Adabelle Wells, her colleagues, her friends owned that grocery store. So it was a very thriving community. And I agree with you, right? And I think as they're developing, and you probably see some of the development downtown Memphis, how, and I'm hoping it makes its way that way, but makes its way that way in a way that does not, displace the people. But I agree with you. If they could just use Lemoyne as that centric point in that, because it's already sitting in community. And what are some of the ways in which they work with even the local congregations there to really have a well thought out plan that can really bring development there? I can just really see it, because you've been there, you've seen it. I mean, it has all kind of potential. The area has all kind of, and you have Soulville Museum on the other side, right? So they did invest in building that. So it's like, we know you can do it, and I think the city knows that's a good place to set up and to do that development. And how do people in Memphis, though, make sure they're a part of that process when it happens? Because maybe you can talk to us about how I'm sure yourself and others are working with the city, right, in terms of how you are building the importance of being at the table and not necessarily just hoping and wishing when they do development, they include you. So can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of making sure that, you stand on your own moral authority, your own authority to be at the table, to have, be equipped with the information, know what you're talking about, right? But how we have representation that's representing us, but also knows what you're dealing with, the subject matter on the table and how it needs to look and move forward.
Yeah, Reverend Danielle, you're spot on. And this is, I think, the disadvantage that many of us have is we didn't continue the models of the 60s in terms of strategizing, organizing, and mobilizing. So a lot of our efforts are disjointed. They're reactive. We've got to do a better job at developing indigenous leaderships in our communities. I was trained as a community organizer right out of Morehouse. My first job was as a organizer in Boston. And I was pastoring at the same time. So I merged those two. And I saw it really as an extension of the civil rights movement and of course, the Poor People's Campaign. Poor People's Campaign was a grassroots organization effort around issues of economic injustice. And I think we have to push to educate our people and and prepare our people strategically. What I've been able to do, what we've been able to do at Clinton College is that we forced ourselves to the table to have the conversation because we
good.
saw, to your point, just using Memphis as an example, Memphis is growing and exploding in some parts of town,
Right.
right? And so what happened in Rock Hill is basically a bedroom community to Charlotte. It's beginning to grow and it's seeing a lot of development in a project that was called Knowledge Park. The city put a lot of money into it. A lot of investment came. Downtown was transformed. North of the city began to change, but the south side did not. And so we began to have conversations with the mayor and city councilors to say, hey, the same kind of investment you all are doing on this side of town, you need to give equal attention. In fact, the Carolina Panthers and Dave Tepper were scheduled to build all of their training facilities, medical facilities, were going to be retail, residential, commercial. It was a 200, actually, I think it was about a $500 million project. The city had partnered with the county to give them basically $225 million in incentives. And so we're saying, well, if you can do that for them,
Yes.
surely you can do that for us. And because we were organized and they had a loud mouth at the table, it began to change the conversation. And thankfully, I mean, we had some, and I have to give credit to our mayor, who began to see the glaring inequities. And so he began to say, I'm going to do what I can to help level the playing field. And so that's how we got, and we worked through COVID. So we started working on this before COVID. The city actually paid for us to have a city planner to come and work with us. We did all kinds of grassroots organizing. We had charrettes and meetings with people in the community and asked, what are your hopes, desires, and dreams? What we kept hearing over and over again is that they always give us promises that they never deliver on. You know, we got these great plans that came out with fanfare, but now they're sitting on the shelf. And so we wanted to take lessons from the past and say, we're not going to let this happen again. We're going to ensure that this isn't just a slogan, because the city had this slogan called Rock Hill for All. And it was pointing to the fact that not everybody was being lifted in the economic boom that was happening. And so I held them to what they said they were going to do. I said, if this is really Rock Hill for All, Mayor, then we got to make sure that there's equal investment. So long story short, we employed things like tax increment financing district money for infrastructure to attract investment. We even used Tim Scott's brainchild of the Opportunity Zone investments. All of those things we did to begin to attract investors. Now, because we didn't have enough internal strength and couldn't really convince a lot of people that this was a good investment, people with deep pockets, it went a lot slower than we anticipated. But it is happening. In the college, we built a couple of new buildings, and we've begun to clean up the neighborhood around us. And so now people are beginning to look at that side of town differently. And I think it's those kind of conversations of strategizing, organizing, and mobilizing that helps to push the ball. And people are counting on us to be short-sighted, to be distracted, to be divided. And that's what we have to work against. And that's why community organizing is so important.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is just amazing. I think the other thing is I heard you talking, what we also have to do is begin to understand the language of economic development and to understand all the tools in the toolbox so we can be able to sit. So you mentioned tax incentives, you mentioned tips, right?
Yeah, right.
So just we also need to know what's also available. Like you said, if you can do that here, you can do that here. Right. And I think so some of it is also the ways in which we also look out among our communities and our congregations and say, well, who has this knowledge base already? And to your point, how you start with asset mapping, even your own congregations.
That's right.
Right.
That's
so
exactly.
where we're not, and I always say we have everything we need. It's how do we pull it all together, right? And fight against those things you just enumerated, right? The disjointedness, the disconnectedness, and really lack of trust, not trusting one another, et cetera, right? Those things that continue to keep us being reactive. I had a 4-hour-long conversation last night. It didn't start off as going to be that long. It was supposed to be a quick 10-minute call, but it turned into like 4 hours because we started talking about one thing Dr. Haynes mentioned in our previous staff meeting and what we circulated at Proctor this year was the Project 2025 plan. And of course, it's like, so I sent it to somebody and they said, that thing is 900 pages. I was like, yeah, and that's just part one. But to your point, it's organized. There's strategy, it's organized, and it's multiple organizations and people who are saying, you know what, I can do this underground work, right? Yep. And I don't need a main leader. We all understand we play a part in our collective ability to maintain power and control in this country, right? Yes. A far-right Republican plan to maintain control of institutions and to continue to run systems in ways that give us systemic problems, right? I'm saying, to your point, we have to do that kind of work. And that's a lot of head work. That's a lot of work. You may not see the benefits of that in your lifetime, but the point is you're trying to set up generations to come, right? And so I thank you for how you really said that very succinctly where anybody can understand exactly, because that's what has to happen. So I think you mentioned also that we have not really followed the model that they used in the 50s and 60s. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you know of Dr. King and his call for because I'm thinking about now his last speech at Mason Temple, right? How he shifted to, calling for economic boycotts. Don't put your money here. Put your money in black banks. LCSC is getting ready to open up an account at the black bank, right? I think it's Tri-State Bank, I believe. So can you tell us a little bit about what you see as some lessons from those movements that are still viable today, even though it may mean we have to use them in a different kind of way, but it still works?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that King came belatedly to the game is around group-centered leadership. Mm-hmm. The old model in the critique of the civil rights movement is that number one, it was patriarchal. Secondly, it was hierarchical.
Yes.
It was around this model of the charismatic leader, and of course, King was it. And of course, people like Ella Baker began to challenge King and deliberately designed SNCC to be group-centered. And so on one hand, and I think the lessons of the Black Lives Matter movement helps us to see that we saw some flaws in this model of having the HNIC.
Right.
And that we needed to empower and employ more people, more voices, more diverse perspectives. And so I think that those are lessons that kind of fuse the best of our movement. There's no, and let me come back to King because I think this is really important. There's no denying the fact that King was a genius, but he was only a genius because he was produced by the Black community.
That's right.
And so people want to give credit to Crozier and Boston University for his theological genius. That was honed in the Black social gospel tradition of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, and Morehouse College.
Yeah,
that's really where he got it. And his sense of accountability, I think, became much more stark in his later years when he realized how difficult it was to move white power. He was counting on, he was ecumenical, and we see it in the letter from the Birmingham jail. You're beginning to see his frustration with white clergymen who just don't get it.
Right.
Who are so wed to white power and white Christian nationalism that they can't see their own blind spots around, structural systemic racism. And so King still tried. I mean, he still tried to appeal to white brothers and sisters, to his Jewish brothers and sisters to be a part of the movement. But he came to the conclusion that, you know what, power concedes nothing without a demand.
Uh-huh.
It never did, and it never will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he came, and you mentioned it early on, the silver rights. He realized that, yeah, we got access to the restaurant, but can we afford to buy at the restaurant? And greater than that, can we afford to own the restaurant? And he realized that's where the real equality and eventually equity. The king didn't use the word, but that's what he was moving towards, was a conversation around equity. And he didn't use the R word, reparations, but that's what he was basically talking about. Reparations, like, look, y'all owe us. When you look at all that has been stolen from Black people and all that we have invested in the economy, how we've been exploited and commodified, all of these things, King came to this realization that we need a total revolution of values. And that's his language, a revolution of values. And he, came to this idea that we need a poor people's campaign. And America needs to reinvest. They need to have a guaranteed income for people. We need to make sure that people have access to capital and wealth. I mean, he just began to see a new, and he used the term democratic socialism. We need a new model because the old model, not only does it not work, but it has been evil for so long.
That's right. It's
just evil. And we need to transform that. And I think that's part of the legacy that people don't want to talk about.
That's right.
We all want to go to the, sit down at the table of brotherhood as brothers and sisters.
Right.
I haven't, but we don't want to talk about. King started the speech by saying, we've come to cash a check that has come back marked insufficient funds.
Right.
Was making the case for economic justice. And that's 1963, the speech. By 1967, he's calling for a guaranteed income for all people, and then eventually calling for a whole poor people's campaign.
Yeah, and I think, oh man, you said so much there. So a few things.
I'm sorry.
No. We want that, right? This is what we're looking to talk about, because I think sometimes we can freeze people in a moment in time. And then it becomes more like a, to use Reggie Williams, like a holy habit of just honoring and freezing that person in time, when in fact, what King was going after is still very much alive and well today. And how we just don't leave King there, but we take King's spirit and it's still with us. And how do we build on that, right? And not just leave him as a dreamer. Right, because that's what they try to sell us. And I always tell people, during King Holiday weekend, if you go buy some appliances on a King Holiday sale, you need to take it back, right? that's totally antithetical to what he would have you do, right? But I want to read something from King's speech from 66, because you're hitting on that, and then I want to kind of come back to it with a couple more questions as a follow-up. So, because it really goes to what you just said. But he says it's easy to conceive a plan to raise the minimum wage and thus a single stroke extract millions of people from poverty. But between the conception and the realization, there lies a formidable wall. Someone has been profiting from the low-wage Negroes. Depressed living standards for Negroes are a structural part of the economy. And when I read that, I thought about two things. One, and you kind of hit on it about the check of insufficient funds. It's a clip I play it every year around his birthday. It's that 3-minute clip where he really, lays out the way that the government, right, funded the land grant colleges. The way that the government undergirded as he called the European peasants with money and mechanized their farms. How the government really invested in, right, the thriving of white people specifically. Yep. Right. And when he said, and to your point, I just love that clip, because he said, then we go to D.C., right? We going to get our check. So that's really, right. He was like, I want what you owe me. This ain't no hand-me-down. This not a gift. This what you owe us. Right? And I think that's the King that I want people to think about on today. Yes, right? Ma'am. And that he did his portion, because we all forget, and sometimes we say the March on Washington, we forget it's for jobs and freedom.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so when we think about the economy and labor force, because now, I think it's California who recently, I guess it's in effect now, that I know restaurant workers, they use McDonald's as an example. But I'm assuming it's across the board, right? It's a $20 minimum wage in California.
Yeah.
That went into effect. So I'm wondering, how do we also have conversation around, going back to when you said, King said, we can integrate this lunch counter, but can you buy the hamburger? And moreover, can you own your own restaurant? So talk to us a little bit about what are some of what you can see are some of the discriminatory economic systems and policies that keep Black households from achieving. We had not necessarily because I think the American dream is really American farce, right? I don't even know what that means for the average person, but theoretically, when we say American dream, and really about wealth, Black people being able to obtain wealth. I keep reading these studies that by 2030 or 2050, that there'll be 0% of Black wealth in our hands. So what are, King kind of had his model of the calling for the economic boycott, don't buy seal test, don't buy Wonder Bread. So what would you say is something we need to be thinking about now from an individual level in our homes, and what people can do every day, right? In light of the economy, the economic system, the policies that are currently in place. So now let's kind of bring it to an individual level. And then I want to kind of go back out to more of a communal and systemic and systematic level.
Right. Yeah. So it is actually a both and, right? I mean, to raise the level of consciousness, it's going to have to be a communal effort where we help people to understand. It's like going back to our African roots. The only reason African Americans were able to survive the Great Ma'afa, survive slavery, survive Jim Crow, is we had a village, that we were responsible to one another. When I was coming up, even in the projects, we had a neighbor. I would be at my grandmother's apartment all the time, and she had a woman that lived in the same building, Miss Lucas, who would come over regularly for a cup of sugar or a cup of milk, right? The premise was that, one day, my grandmother would have to ask her. I don't remember my grandmother ever having to ask her for a couple, but it was this understanding that we would share with each other. If you had a need, you would share. We would look out for each other. And that in its own way was sort of an economic safety net. That economic safety net isn't there. We already know the abysmal statistics about wealth in the Black community. We don't own much. The American dream of owning a house is very difficult, because we know how, to your point, about how systems were built to exploit Black people with subprime loans, and these exorbitant interest rates. The student loan crises has affected Black folks much more than it has white folks. Just the cost to do business, the cost to buy, regular groceries and things that you need. So we've got to raise the consciousness and awareness. On one hand, we've got to fight against it. We also have to tell our people that we've got to be better stewards of our resources. And so we got to find a way for the money to recirculate in our own communities. That's right. I think we do have to raise more people with entrepreneurial spirits, so that we can start owning our own businesses. I have an example in Rock Hill. There's a brother, I love Jonathan Nasir. He's become my comrade in the struggle. He has been, and of course, Heber Brown.
Right, yes.
He's Rock Hill's Heber Brown around Black farm.
Okay.
And he started a place up the street called the Pharmacy, FARM, Pharmacy, that brings fresh produce, fresh fruit to the community, and talking about health and nutrition. All those things go hand in hand. And if we could develop a whole, for lack of a better term, a curriculum around that, we're constantly teaching and re-educating our people that all of this is connected. I remember the old folks saying that health is wealth. If you don't have health, you don't have anything. And we already know how terrible the health indices are in our communities, which is why we even now have a term called health equity, right? Because we realize how related that is to our total well-being. So again, I think it's developing a curriculum in so many different ways.
That's good.
So some of it is kind of changing mindsets around our philosophies, believing that white ice is colder than black ice. It's working that angle, but it's also giving people what we call in college now, it's this real hot term of experiential learning, so that we take the lessons out of the classroom and, we live them in the sense of a great theological term, praxis,
Right.
of reflection and action while we do it, so that people see that this is not just some theory. This is a way of life. And it is the way of life that is closest to our ancestors' understanding of stewardship of the earth.
And when you say that, here's what I think. Community, village, two different things. And I was talking to Mama Itahari, Dr. Itahari Torre, who I call Mama Itahari affectionately. We were just chatting and we were talking about the difference between community and village. And so, because a village, she says, and this goes back to where you just left off about the ancestors, right? Villages have systems, structures, institutions, maximizes resources. Everyone has value, therefore everybody is valuable. You realize what value add do you have to this village, and how do you allow people to live out to the best of who they have been designed to be. Because we talk about, when we talk about, fearfully and wonderfully made in Genesis, we love to say that. We love to go to Jeremiah 1:5. I knew you before you were formed in your mother's womb, which tells us that you have identity and purpose before you're born.
Yes.
Right. So how do we, when children come into this world, how do we nurture them in ways that draws out what's already in them? That they become part of this larger village where we maximize, right, our resources and the people in the village to create those healthy structures, institutions, and systems. And I think we have definitely gotten away from that. And so we say we need to create a village, and I think that's where we need to go with that. But it's the way we have a common lens and a common language. And I think, to your point, a curriculum does that.
Yes.
Because I can put something in front of you and we can walk through. And in fact, I don't know if Cheryl, she don't like being on camera, but she might want to come in and comment on the ways that's one of the things we're doing in the justice ministry. We're trying to get us to understand, one, the difference between charity and justice, but also the importance of solidarity power, and also the power of relationships. Right? Because there's some foundational things you have to know and understand if you're going to move forward. Other than that, we're doing this as an individual or individual organization, and that could never be institutions and the systemic issues that we're up against.
That's right.
And that's why my 4-hour conversation got that long, because me and the person was just kind of good, healthy back and forth. Because part of what they positioned, that to get to the economic equity that we need, to deal with the injustice of economics that we have and all the other injustices, that we need a strong figure to call the people together. And I was like, I don't know if we're looking at a person to come along and pull us out. That's we've seen how that model works. And you talked about it earlier, right? With that centralized patriarchy, hierarchy, it doesn't work. Right, even Ambassador Young, when King was assassinated, even in later interviews, even Ambassador Young said when King died, we didn't know what to do. Right? And the whole time, Ella Baker was saying, you need to decentralize this. We need to build. I felt she was really saying, like she said, you'll never see me on TV. You'll never read an article about me, because I've tried to play the kind of role that pulls pieces together or gather pieces that would eventually, lead into an organization or organized movement, right? Because I think she understood you got to have something in place.
That's right.
Right? Not just for the moment, just like our dear Republican white folks. If it's Project 2025, if they letting you read it now, it's already in motion.
That's right.
You wouldn't be reading it if it wasn't already in motion. It wasn't. And 900 pages, and you got to admit, you took time. And when you look at that thing, I'm like, we better get going. And I'm so inspired by what you're doing at Clinton College, because, and this is another thing I was telling the person we were just kind of going, I said, no, you look at that project and you clearly see multiple organizations that do their own work, but understand we all going to plug into this one project that we all agree on. So maybe one person gonna deal with the government, the other person gonna deal with getting people put in all these different offices. Like everyone has a part to play. No one is looking to be out front and be the one, because they're all bought into maintaining these structures and institutions and these systems and making sure it works the way it's working. And as King said, because to keep people oppressed, to keep people in certain stations in life, people benefit from that. It's structural. They benefit from the economic exploitation. So we have to not look at a figure to come along, but see yourself as part of the solution.
That's right.
Right. Now we all gonna be a part of this. And I can't remember, was it a show we did? Reggie Williams, we talked about we all have to see ourselves in justice movements because we all have something to offer. And we have to let the table be large enough where, because I may not think just like you, show up like you show up, doesn't mean I don't need to be at this table and I have value add. That's the village.
That's exactly right.
We don't put people out the village. Now, I do think you can put yourself out.
Yeah, right.
And I'll leave that right there. But there are some ways in which you can put yourself out the village.
We have some. Yeah.
Right. So there's that. So maybe
can't come to the picnic anymore.
We're done. We're done. You have violated. So I'm wondering then. So I guess as oh yes. Cheryl wants to ask you a question. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to accentuate a statement that you made about the importance of the village and that everyone has a part. And the thing that we are trying to do within the Justice Ministry at Friendship West is to make sure people really see what they can bring to the table. Right. Everyone's not going to be a Cheryl Prelo. Everyone's not going to be a Danielle Ayers, but we need you to be the best person that you can be and bring those gifts and talents, because there's so much work to be done. There's so much work to be done that there's a place for everyone. But how, for me, I feel like our charge is really helping people to understand that you do actually have something to bring. And you as an individual can help make a difference by acknowledging, understanding, discovering what that is that you bring to the table, and then be a part of that movement. So that's all I wanted to add.
No, I appreciate that, because that's really what we strive for.
Yes.
As they say, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few.
Yes.
Ain't that the truth? That's what I try every day to say to my students at Clinton. I want them to understand. My Morehouse brother Eddie Glaude has a new book out. I haven't gotten it yet. I bought it. The title of the book is "We Are the Leaders We Are Looking For." Yeah, and I think that really is it. Like we don't need to look for another Martin Luther King.
That's right.
I went to Morehouse on a wing and a prayer, and I went there because of Martin Luther King. I mean, he was my hero as a kid coming up. I wanted to be at least in the strain of Dr. King. But you know who I found at Morehouse? I found Benjamin Elijah Mays.
Come on.
Mays had just died right before I got there. So I went to Morehouse in 1984. Mays had died, I think, that March. And the more I discovered, the more I learned about Dr. King, the more I appreciated Benjamin Elijah Mays, because Mays was the mentor to King. And I started saying to myself, there are a lot of people that want to be Dr. King, but who wants to be Dr. Mays? That's who I want to be. Yeah. I want to be the person who helps to develop and nurture the next generation of leaders.
Yes.
And we need more of that. Yes. We need people to stop saying, I want to be Jesse Jackson. I want to be Al Sharpton or whoever. Why not be the person who can provide wisdom and counsel and support and inspiration and guidance and education, for these people? That's what we need to be investing in. And I think, again, I don't want to over-romanticize or glamorize our ancestors, but I think they had it right when they built these schools with meager means. I mean, when I think about how Clinton College was started in 1894 with just a little bit of money, all these institutions were built because our ancestors saw the long game. It's like we may not see the full experience of freedom, but we want our children to have it. And the key to it is education. Right? They've got to get educated. They have to have a path of social mobility that will allow them to compete with anybody. And I think that's the strategy that we need to redouble our efforts on.
Let me tell you, man, you said a lot of good stuff right there. Because I do think that's where I think that's where it is. And I think that's what I was trying to get the person we were having this conversation with last night. Like, we have to see ourselves as two things. Number one, all we have, because I do think we have everything we need in our community. We really don't have to go look out here for it, go ask somebody for. We have it. It's how do we pull all of this together and not really worry about credit, not worry about what it means for me specifically, but can we come together for the benefit of generations to come? And I say this all the time in the justice ministry. I tell them, this type of work, if you're looking for immediate gratification, if you're looking for the fact you went down to Austin and testified before committee, you went to City Hall and it didn't work out, that it's over, I'm done with that, this is probably not the ministry for you. Because this ministry is about the grind.
Yes.
It is about constantly, like I say, the wheels of justice turn, but it turns slowly.
Slowly.
Right? It's how can you have the stamina to stay with it, right? And I always point them back to Hebrews 11. It says, some died not having received the promise. Then we go to 12:1. Therefore, you have this cloud of witnesses, right? Yeah. And Dr. Haynes preached that thing one Sunday, and the way he broke down that 12:1 was, that means you have a Harriet Tubman tapping you on your shoulder. You have a Sojourner Truth, Ida Bell Wells Barnett, right? It's not about, to your point, romanticizing the ancestors, but it is about looking to them and say, that spirit is still with you. Yes, that you now have your race to run. Yes. And they're simply tapping you saying, run your race. Yep. Right? And not mine, not somebody else's, but yours. And I think that has a lot to do with going back to when we're born. If we don't get that proper nourishment and nurturing that we need to draw out of us that's already in us, we'll spend time doing maybe a job, doing a call in life that's not even designed for us. Right? So we're out of place. So therefore, I probably really can't come to church or come to Clinton College, come to other places and really be able to give my best because I'm not even being who I was called to be. Yeah. Right. So it's really about how do we really center ourselves, say, well, what is my, because I promise you, if you do that, you'll flourish in your way. Because that's you being you. Can't nobody beat you being you. Yep. And as they say, the only person you ought to be competing with today is yourself from yesterday to be better. Yes.
You preaching good, Reverend.
And that's because I think that's where we fall short in our communities, though, right? We're striving to be somebody else. Yes.
Right.
Without saying you might be famous being you, but you can't beat Beyonce being Beyonce. Yes.
Exactly.
I don't care how hard you try. Yes. Right? So I think we have to do that because we need people like that who are walking out their specific call in life to be a part of these movements. So that when you come into the movements, you're not disruptive to the movements.
Amen.
And hopefully that can kind of draw back some of the mistrust, the jealousy, the lack of integrity, lack of commitment, lack of courage, right? Because you're confident that this is what I'm supposed to be doing, so therefore I'm going to show up as fully my authentic self. And I think that Reggie was challenging us on, we talked about going into Palm Sunday, right? Think about Palm Sunday. Who is your authentic self going into Palm Sunday? Right? And so I think that is a part of dealing with all you laid out so brilliantly today, that we need people who are equipped and ready. And if we have the right village, they'll get the nourishment they need.
Yeah. Right? I never thought about the difference between village and community.
Yeah, Mama Tahari broke that down for me. I was like, okay, yes, ma'am. That's why that's why you sit and listen to the elders. And that is why we can't be pitting, and I do hate to see the pitting of movements when people, it's not your grandma's movement. They didn't do it right this way. We know the right way. No. It's about everybody can be critiqued. Yes.
That's right.
But we say what's the best of all of it to keep moving us forward. How do we learn? Right? We ain't in competition. And that's one thing people know that'll drive me crazy when I hear people. We're gonna fight back. Y'all don't know history. Who didn't fight back?
Right.
Because they showed you history this way. Yes. I could listen, read. Right. So, but yes, I think that's a good place to kind of end this part of the conversation. Do I have time? This is something I want to ask him about. I have 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna do this. So let me thank you for giving us such rich dialogue today around this issue and honoring that legacy of a Dr. King and what he was really striving for before he was murdered, assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, on the balcony of the Rain Hotel, where you will go and be on that sacred ground today. So blessings to you as you go in that space, and may you find peace, hope, healing, and even some renewed encouragement to do the work that you have to go back and do. So blessings on you for that. But one thing I saw on social media, and I usually ask what about you, but this is going to be an about you, but a different way. That the documentary that's been produced about you, From Homelessness to Morehouse, you got to tell us about it. You got to drop that. Yeah, you got to drop that on us as we go out.
Yeah, so I still don't understand how this happened. But so D Brown, who is the CEO of the P3 Group, which stands for Public-Private Partnership, we've been doing some things together around building a new residence hall and dining hall on campus. And he's a serial entrepreneur. He's got this show called HBCU, where he interviews people on the PBS station. And so let me plug my iPad. Looks like it's getting ready to go down here. I want to make sure.
You can't go down on us.
Right. Okay. I think I got it. So we're doing this interview, and he talks about, well, how did you get to Morehouse, all this? And I said to him, well, actually, I went from no house to Morehouse. He's like, huh? And I was like, yeah, I was homelessness in high school. We got evicted from the projects that I referenced earlier when I was about 13 years old. And my mother and my sister and I moved in with my grandmother in the apartment in the projects where she was raising my 3 cousins because their mother had died. And my mother and grandmother fell out. So it began a spiral. And I didn't realize until later on that my mother was really struggling with mental health issues that were exacerbated by the stress.
Yes.
So we went from pillar to post. I stayed in a shelter for battered women and children. I was a squatter in an abandoned building. One time we moved in with a nasty, dysfunctional, alcoholic white family. It was horrific. And just and finally one day I called my pastor. The last time we got evicted, I was just so despondent and just ready to give up. And I told him, what had happened. And he asked what I call now an existential question. Lester, where are you? And to me, it was more than a geographic question.
Yeah.
But he came and picked me up and moved me into the parsonage of the Belmont Street AME Zion Church in Worcester, Massachusetts, and changed my life. He became the father I never knew, and he pushed me. He had an earned doctorate. He's the first Black person I knew that had an earned doctorate. I think there was one Black doctor in town, but he had a doctorate of ministry. Wow. He had been a professor and a pastor. And I was like, wow, I want this, So long story short, he helps me get into Morehouse on a wing and a prayer. And I'll never forget the Baptist preacher across town, Reverend Wright, his son and daughter were at Morehouse in Spelman. He let me come bring my trunk with all of my belongings in his van, drove to Atlanta, sat in the business manager's office, Mr. Wiley Purdue, and finally got to see him and said, this young man doesn't have money, but he's got potential. And if you let him register, I promise he's going to make you proud. Aww. And he said, and here's the catcher, this is so relevant to today. He went back to Worcester for the Martin Luther King program in January. And he said to the crowd, y'all remember Lil Lester, who used to say the I Have a Dream speech? Well, now he's at Dr. King's alma mater and he ain't got no money. We have to help him. And they raised an offering that day to pay my spring tuition at Morehouse College. Amen. And so I do what I do out of a sense of indebtedness. I get to pay it forward now because I see Lester McCorns every day on my campus. Amen. Who have no hope, no possibility. They think in their minds, and I have to remind them, to your earlier point, you are a unique gift from God. And you have, Dr. Mays used to always say to students at Morehouse, if you don't do it, it won't get done. You have been placed on this earth to carry out a specific assignment. And if you don't do it, it won't get done. And that resonated with me. And I've been just trying to do my assignment all of these 58 years of my life.
All right now.
we got to stop right. I mean, I'm gonna go out on that. I'm not even gonna add commentary. I knew you were gonna have an amazing story. When I started on Facebook, I was like, oh, I gotta ask him about this, because what you just said was everything you just said is sums up what we talked about today, right? It's about the village, and it's about how do we maximize the value that all of us have, and how do we shore up our institutions so that we have places for us to go to produce a Lester McCorn, right? I mean, you are not just making your folk proud, your Morehouse folk proud, you making all of us proud. Amen. So I'm so glad to have had you on today. And it's in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a conversation around, I think it's John Wilson's book, about HBCUs.
Oh,
yes.
good.
So we're going to have Reverend Durr, who's already read the text, and we're going to come break that down. And in light of what we see happen with TSU and our other HBCUs who are now, we're unearthing like all this money that is owed. So I'm gonna make sure we pull Clinton College into that conversation as we have that Reverend Durr. As I tell everybody, and it just happens, we got to have you back.
Yes.
And so much more we want to talk about. But thank you for being here today. We are honored to have had you in this space today. So thank you so much for being here. So listen, you see the wonderful, amazing guests we have coming to Fannie Lou's Classroom with very substantive conversation that we hope where you just hear so much, you have rabbit holes you can go down, you can dig, you can learn. We are about, that organic learning, that organic scholar that you can become by coming into the classroom. Because that was Fannie Lou Hamer. She didn't have formal education, but she was well educated. And so that's what we want to do with the classroom. So you can support us by purchasing your Fannie Lou Classroom t-shirt. And if you're watching online, you can scan the QR code. You can order the t-shirt. If you're watching on your phone, you can go to Friendship West /justice, and you have a link where you can order that t-shirt. Next week's episode is going to be just as amazing as we continue our work and conversation around Black maternal health and how we create a circle of care around our Black mothers, as Black women are 3 times more likely to die as complications from health care as white women, as Hispanic women, and Asian women. So we're trying to raise awareness around that, but not just awareness, but what we can do, create an alternative system of care to make sure Black women not just survive childbirth, but thrive after that. So we're going to have Dr. Kyra Brown and Misty Wilder with us. You don't want to miss next week's as we talk about living into motherhood, where we can make sure our mothers have all they need before they even conceive, all the way up until the child at least turns 1 to 2 years old. Yes. What can we do? We have what we need in community, but we need all of us to be aware that we might be advocates and that we might be activists to make sure we get what we need by way of policy and laws that are passed for coverage. In Texas, we were finally able to get HB 12 passed through Representative Tony Rose, where women on Medicaid don't just have 2 months of coverage post-birth, but 12 months, which is recommended by physicians. So we have so much more work to do in our upcoming legislative session around doula care and other ways that we know that can help Black women survive. So join us next week, 12 o'clock noon, here in the classroom. We look forward to seeing you next week.
From the church to the